Hello and welcome to India Back on Track, an agenda for reform. This is the third show in a three-part series that Network 18's Think India Foundation is producing in partnership with the Washington, D.C.-based Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, one of the world's finest and most influential think tanks. India Back on Track is based on a book published by the Carnegie Endowment, which has essays written by leading Indian thinkers on how the new government can reinvigorate its economic and foreign policies. In today's show, we will discuss economic policy. At the core of the debate is the question of whether Prime Minister Modi can deliver on his promise of minimum government, maximum governance. Joining us in the studio to debate this is a sterling panel of economists. Vivek Debroy, professor at the Center for Policy Research, who is also a co-editor of the book. Surjit Bhalla, chairman of Oxis Research and Investments, who is the author of a key chapter in this book. And with them is Raghav Behel, founder and editor of Network 18. This show will deal with two critical issues which were the Achilles heel of the UPA government. First, the administrative deficit and the policy paralysis that accompanied it. And second, the fiscal deficit, which meant that government spending pretty much outcrowded more efficient private sector spending. Let me begin with administrative reform, Vivek. Part of the problem, of course, was the UPA's political policy paralysis, but some of it is structural as well, as you suggest in your book. For example, the Prevention of Corruption Act, which you quote, says that while holding office, a public servant, if he obtains for any person anything or pecuniary advantage which is without public interest, then he is liable for prosecution. Now, isn't this a structural constraint on the honest functioning of the bureaucracy?
Yes, of course. Essentially, what we are talking about is two related points. One is when there is a bureaucrat who takes a mala fide decision, is there a credible deterrent and is there credible punishment? And the other side of that is protecting the bona fide bureaucrat, and both have to be done simultaneously. Some of this, a large part of it is legislative, including the Prevention of Corruption Act. A little bit can be done through the executive. I should quickly add that a bill to amend the Prevention of Corruption Act has been pending in Rajya Sabha for some time. The standing committee has submitted its report, and in terms of the nitty-gritty, two reports of the Second Administrative Reforms Commission have outlined exactly what one should do on both counts, the mala fide as well as the bona fide.
Surjit, in a way, we've seen a movement backwards on this front of the last few years, whether it's the CAG, CVC, even the judiciary, which recently said that bureaucrats can be actually prosecuted without prior sanction from the government. Isn't this dissuading bureaucrats from taking decisions? Is this a problem?
Yeah, look, I mean, we can list the problems, but basically what has happened over the last several years is nobody's acting, and that everybody is being prevented from acting for various reasons, whether legal, administrative, or political. So I think, what we need and what perhaps is going to happen and is happening is that there is a clear-cut delineation of responsibilities, of governance, of administration, so that people can be held accountable. Part of the thing when you started off with maximum government or whichever way it is that governance means accountability. You cannot have any kind of governance without accountability. So I hope that whether it is in administration or in policy or whatever, people and officers are accountable for their actions.
Raghav, accountability is something we always talk about, but the bureaucrats and the bureaucracy in general has always been more interested in reward. So you have pay commission after pay commission. In fact, the recent one was set up by the UPA before it's left office. Can that be used as a tool to enforce accountability on the bureaucracy?
Well, certainly. I mean, these are time-tested models are in place here. But I think it's ultimately about the leadership taking decisions and taking the rap for those decisions. Over the last few years, we saw that the leadership had abdicated its decision-making responsibility, which is a risk-taking exercise because decisions go wrong, decisions go right. But someone has to stand behind the decision and say, I took it in the best possible manner, I took it with the best possible intentions, and if it's gone wrong, well, I'm sorry, but there was nothing wrong intention there. I think that went away, and therefore down the line, no one was willing to take decisions. And in that vacuum stepped in the judiciary, in that vacuum stepped in all kinds of vested interests which started. So I think it comes from there.
Vivek, another problem with the bureaucracy which you've pointed out in your chapter in the book is that it's rather bottom heavy. So the class A officers, or the ones we know as the IAS officers, form about 3% of the bureaucracy, whereas the lower rungs, C and D, which are largely the clerical staff, form about 80% or near about that number. Does this in any way impede efficient government?
Yes, but let's put it like this, that when one is talking about the government in India, we often tend to focus on central government, but there's the state government. The thrust of the book is, of course, on the central government. And quite often there is an argument that, look, bureaucrats, central government bureaucrats, need to be paid more because the private sector is paid exorbitant salaries. What's important to remember is the great variance that exists in the private sector and the narrow variance that exists within the government sector, and the fact that 90% is C and D who don't really do anything very productive. So the issue is not really the size of government defined in terms of government employees, but what those government employees actually do.
Surjit, there's also the question of who's doing what. Now, one of the things Vivek pointed out was there's a central government and state government. At the moment, does the central government do far too much compared to what they should be doing?
Oh, absolutely. There's just no question.
So what are the sort of things which can be immediately devolved to a state government bureaucracy or state government?
You know, my view is practically everything. And let me just explain that in a minute. What would be desirable from my point of view is that the money that is given to the states for the central government collects taxes, collects everything, and then is distributed back to the states. There's a finance commission that decides how much is to be given. On top of that, there is NREGA, there's PDS, and there's all these other things that the government is involved in. Why can't we do the following simple policy? And I mean, it's simple and I think it's realistic. The state government is given all the money that is decided by the finance commission. There is no NREGA, there is no PDS. The state government decides what to do. If it wants to go ahead and dig for gold underneath temples, it is their prerogative. They will be thrown out. This is, you know, what we've seen in the recent elections is that the people are really, really fed up with how the state governments have performed, how the central government has performed, and they will vote out people. So therefore, let them do it, and they will do it. So therefore, why is it that somebody in the center knows that who's got to be given employment and at what rate and whatever this thing is? This is, you know, we've gone into a mindless extreme with the central government's involvement.
And Raghav, rather than bureaucrats in Delhi deciding what's good for the rest of the country, or even bureaucrats in state capitals, there is a case for devolving power further down, say to urban local bodies or to panchayats. I mean, this is surely the way to go for the future.
Oh, absolutely. In a genuinely federal structure, most of the policy making functions which are pan-Indian would stay with the central government. But very little implementation power or implementation accountability should even be with the central government. So implementation happens on the ground. It's by people who are closer to the event, to the act. And therefore, all of that should devolve down. So absolutely, you should dismantle these layers of implementation that we've got in India, where the central government has got one layer to see what the minimum wage should be in some district, and then there is a state government, and then there is a district administration, and then there is a local administration. So really, the first layer to dismantle is the central government, and everything else could follow.
Vivek, the fact that Narendra Modi has been a chief minister, does that give you added optimism that such decentralization could happen?
Yes, of course, but I think we need to be a little bit careful. I'm endorsing everything that Surjit and Raghav said. I'm just putting in some caveats. The caveat number one is, to do what is being suggested, we have to restore the constitutional mandate of the Finance Commission and therefore reduce drastically, if not abolish, the role of the Planning Commission, which also means government budgetary classifications between plan and non-plan, all of that stuff. The more important question to ask is, why did centrally sponsored schemes proliferate since the end of the 1960s? We were perfectly happy without these large number before that. And the reason for that was the center felt legitimately or illegitimately that the states would not introduce the necessary reforms. So hence the question, how do you incentivize the states, and I'm using the word incentivize, to introduce various reforms, the kind of stuff that's been done, let's say, under the JNNURM that has an incentivization. And the last point I want to mention, to again add to what Raghav has said, let's not forget the role of the state finance commissions, which are responsible for devolution within the states, much more important for panchayats than for urban local bodies, because urban local bodies actually have some sources of revenue that they can tap, not true for panchayats. Right. The problem is that the recommendations of state finance commissions are either non-existent, or when they exist, they have been flouted.
Right. So there you have it. There are plenty of suggestions to streamline administration. Maximum government isn't only about minimizing the bureaucracy and making it more efficient. It's also about devolving power to state governments, to urban local bodies, and to panchayats. Time to take a break. After the break, we'll discuss the fiscal overhang, the large fiscal overhang left by the UPA, and how this can be reduced to make more space for the more efficient private sector. Be right back. Welcome back to India Back on Track, an agenda for reform. In the first section of the show, we spoke about how to eliminate the government's administrative deficit. In the second section, we are going to talk about how to eliminate the fiscal deficit. Remember, the fiscal deficit is not just a number. It's not just about the government spending more. It's because when the government spends more, it crowds out the more efficient private sector from the same use of resources. It also makes it more expensive for the private sector to borrow. So this is an extremely serious problem which the new government needs to address if the economy is to get back on track. So Jeet, you have very explicit and hardline views on this. How much can the government do in this first budget which is coming up to eliminate wasteful subsidies?
These are not my views, whatever you call hardline, are not really hardline, they're very practical. But I think the second part of the question, which is how much can they do, I think it's very important for the government to realize that this budget is possibly the most significant policy document they'll have in the next 10 years. Let's assume they're there for 10 years. Everybody's focus is on this budget, this first real policy document. Now, that doesn't mean all the policies have to be announced in this budget, none of that. But what it does mean is that people are looking for some indication. We've had all kinds of talk about the change in the nature of the government, on the fiscal deficit, etc. We want an indication. People want an indication, not just the markets, not just people in the financial markets. They're also very interested. But everybody wants to know, what is this government going to do? So now, what can they do? Look, the fiscal deficit is really an accounting identity which has total revenues collected and total expenditure. The best way to understand what this government can do is to realize how the previous governments in India, and especially the UPA government in the last 10 years, decided on the budget. They said, listen, we have to spend this much on, if you will, in the name of the poor programs, because that's what our ideology is, that's where we think our votes are, etc. So they decide on the spending first. Then they say we've got to raise taxes, obviously. So they go ahead and raise taxes. Then they find out that there's a large gap, much more than what they would like to present. Then they say, okay, let's have special methods of raising money, and let's try retrospective taxation or something else. It's really been completely misguided, mishandled, and misthought out procedure.
Vivek, can I just quickly ask you, I mean, why has no government been able to make the case that a lot of the subsidies that are given, whether it's fuel or food, go to people who don't really need them?
One must be careful. One must be careful for the following reasons. That the subsidies are delivered by who? The subsidies are by and large delivered by state governments. And we still do not have consensus on two very important issues. One, who are the BPL? How do we identify the BPL? Unambiguously, the beneficiaries of subsidies. Two, to the extent that there is a subsidy, how much does the center bear and how much is borne by the states? Until we solve these two issues, fertilizers are different, but until we solve these two issues, I don't think we'll have much progress on targeting any consumption subsidies efficiently.
Raghav, there's a view which has been expressed among others by Arvind Panagria, that the fiscal deficit, the size of the deficit doesn't matter. And Sujit makes this point in his book, in the book chapter as well. But what matters is the composition of bad subsidies versus good expenditure. Now, the government needs to spend on health, education, roads, etc. Do you think there's scope for that, or is the fiscal situation just too bad for any increase in expenditures in substantive areas?
I'll pick up from what Sujit said, that this document, which is going to come in July, is even more important than the 1991 document, which set India off on reforms, and the world is watching. Now, according to me, there are two fundamental things which cannot be done on day one, but they need to be articulated and need to be implemented. One is significant, perhaps over a 36-month period, reform of subsidy targeting, subsidy delivery, and therefore, by consequence, elimination of a large portion of the wasteful deficit. So that's something they must do. We are already hearing some noises about, no, we will not fully have diesel prices free. If that is the route that the government decides to go, that will be a disaster. They have to have, according to me, a 36-month adjustment plan for elimination of all non-targeted subsidies to be replaced by targeted subsidies. And of course, identification of beneficiaries, all of that is a challenge, but 36 months is a reasonably long period of time. And the second thing is fundamental taxation reform. You've got to get GST, you've got to eliminate retrospective amendments completely, and you've got to simplify your tax structure. These are the two fundamental reforms which will lead to exactly what you've asked for. Elimination of the waste and good expenditure coming in, and that will in any case create the space for private sector to come in with all productive investments while the state starts focusing on all the social sector investments. Have to do this.
Sujit, even in this tough fiscal scenario, is there a scope to cut tax rates?
Look, absolutely. First of all, you can, what did I say earlier? That the fiscal deficit is an accounting thing, which is a difference in taxes and difference in expenditures. Now, there are two things that will happen when you cut taxes. First, you will immediately get less revenue, or so you think. Second, a large part of your increase in tax revenue will come about from increased compliance. So therefore, even with the same revenue target, tax revenue target, I can actually get there by decreasing tax rates. So that's number one. Number two is expenditure, if you will, you need to cut bad expenditure, and that's very easy to do. Actually, oil subsidies, which both of them have mentioned, that's very easy to do, and that's at the central level. And if you will, in terms of putting in a 2-year, 3-year program of targeting beneficiaries, replacing our elaborate and corrupt delivery system by cash transfers. That can't be done overnight, but I think things can be put in place. So both of them will help you reduce this fiscal deficit by 2 percentage points over the next 2 years, and that's all you need.
Vivek, give us a sense of numbers. How crucial is reducing the deficit and, in fact, recalibrating the composition of the deficit to India's growth story?
I would still urge some caution. The reason I'm saying I would urge some caution is we are talking about the fiscal deficit, but what we really have in mind is the revenue deficit. The main components of government expenditure are interest payments, subsidies, wages, pensions, and defense expenditure. And I wanted to quickly flag the point that the preceding finance minister succeeded in reducing deficits by slashing plan and capital expenditure, including defense expenditure. A, can you afford to do that? And B, since much of expenditure is frozen in the short run, what can you possibly do to increase revenue? And this means either elimination of tax exemptions, in which case you can certainly reduce tax rates, if not on the direct side, at least on the indirect side, or alternatively non-tax revenue, which means privatization.
Raghav, I'll give you the last word on this. What are the one or two things you would expect the finance minister to do in this budget to give a real confidence boost to investors and to the rest of us in the economy?
Well, I think the one and only thing that if he can do is not to be incremental in any change if he wants to make. So if he's going to talk about an FDI policy, and if you're going to go back to having 26% and 40% and 45%, there are only two FDI rates which are important, 49% and 74%. Nothing else matters. So are we going to see simplification? This is just an example. Are we going to see simplification of our economic apparatus, our economic architecture on that scale? Or is it going to be incremental tinkering around here and there? If it's incremental, then believe me, there's going to be a severe backlash of disappointment.
Yes, I think that's an appropriate note to finish with, because whether you look at the administrative deficit or the fiscal deficit, the time for incremental measures is over. It's time for radical reform. This government has an unprecedented mandate, the biggest mandate in 30 years. If this government can go ahead and make a radical departure from the past, a 1991 plus type of budget, then maybe better days will lie ahead. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.